as it happens, I pulled out a drawer of the Sterilite drawer set that we've got attached underneath the IKEA table. And it just so happens that it's got the fences and everything that I needed, including the fields. And this is a great demonstration of what I was alluding to in the other video, where you can take a fabric, like just corrugated brown fabric, and transfer it just with, double-sided tape or something to a piece of cardstock, or cardboard in this case. And so you have these rigid fields. Now, again, you can't go up the slope with the rigid field. You have to use the actual cloth. And but this is an example of where the fences are not glued on to the fabric. So when you put the fabric down, you can arrange the fences as you like, or leave, or put no fences on. But what it does is it provides for a different look, a more realistic look to the game table. You'll also note that I've transferred hexagon grid to some of these, and so therefore it means hypothetically you want this piece of fabric that's on the cardboard to orient to the hexagon grid. So you can, as I'll show here, this is how it would be if it was following the grid. The field would look like that. This one here has a grid on it that you can probably not even notice, but I can see it. And I can line it up with the existing grid. It would look like this. I think that's close. That's how these fields would be oriented. Now, these are examples of printed graphic applied to a cardstock or cardboard, and with the fences glued on. So look how fast and easy that is to put on the game table. It's already made. Now, mind you, it's not very large. It's not a big field. It's only really just almost 4 hexes. And in this particular case, I've drawn the hexes in a different way because this was an experiment to see if it mattered. And you can see there's 4 hexes on here, whereas if it was following the traditional graphic pattern, the 4 hexes probably wouldn't be arranged on there in that way. They'd have to follow the normal hexagon grid pattern, which would mean it'd be like 3.5 or something hexes like the other fields. But in this case, I just broke that mold and I arranged the hexagons manually to be 4 exact hexes, although they're not following each other's pattern and such. They're just 4 hexes, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's it. And so when I put it down on the game table, the intention here is it doesn't matter what the orientation is of the field, it still has 4 hexes. The other fields that I showed a moment ago, they can do the same thing, but because of the way those hexes are following the hexagon grid, it kind of is a little wonky. You want to follow the grid, but then sometimes you don't. And you could just ignore it. Always, right? You can always just ignore the hexagon grid underneath the field, but you kind of want to have the field to follow the hexagon grid. Okay, so let's say we don't care about following the hexagon grid pattern with these fields that we're putting on top of the game table. Fine. So this is an example here of how this is a darker graphic example of a kind of a green field with burrows in it, as if the soil has recently been tilled. And you can see the hexagon grid pattern there. It's just simply 4 hexes, 1, 2, 3, 4, with there were corners overlapping and so on, because we just didn't care at the moment. We wanted to see if it would work. And it kind of does. So you could follow the hexagon grid, or you could ignore the hexagon grid. But the point is that those fields being put down on the table, they give an impression like that. And the other thing is that when we pulled this trio, we also found our 3D printed homes, which are, if I can hold this one up, pretty cool. So these are just 3D printed homes, generic. They could be anything, any era, and we can put them down. And this kind of reminds me of where we probably did this. when we created this map, these buildings were probably out there. And as you can see, in a table this size, it's a little bit, it's not entirely clear if a game table should have this many buildings. Like, for instance, that's 5 buildings right there. Any more than that, and the game table is going to start to get very complex for this size. This is a 4x3 again. So if we leave these little guys off, if we leave these buildings off, then we can see that it's probably going to be saturated right there. And when we want to put down the fences, that's another issue, and I'll get those. I'll show you from that same tray. Now again, this is from the Sterilite. If you can see, well, you can't really, but anyway, here it is. So this is the large Sterilite tray set. I don't know what you want to call it, but there's 3 trays in it, and they're the larger of all of them. I think it's the largest thing that Sterilite makes, and that's why we've got these upside down. We put the table upside down on the floor and then attach these through with screws to the bottom of the IKEA table. And why are we using an IKEA table? A, it's cheap. B, it's on wheels. I mean, it's relatively cheap, right? All things being relative. The IKEA table is a nice, strong table with good legs and good wheels on the bottom, so it moves around. And the wheels are locking. So anyway, here we are with these fences. Now, these are the snake fences. These are the typical fences you would see, you know, American Civil War, possibly World War II, Europe or something, and American Rev or War of 1812. So, you know, North American continent type of fences. And you'll notice as we see them, you put them down, they're in like this not really long shape. They're short. And the reason for that is so that they're all applied to cardstock, painted brown or something green. But as you set them out, they begin to form that very common American Civil War era, Eastern, maybe Tennessee states look. And if you wanted to use the longer pieces, these longer ones are the Lifelike, I think the brand is called. They're plastic, very light. They're very light, and they're just a straight fence. So I think these are actually called rustic fence. So you can see how with a house, and you'll also notice in this era, or in this location geographically, North America, you wouldn't ever have a house like this right up against the road. It would be unusual for that to happen. This would be very similar to a European configuration. American Civil War, at the time in the expansion of the United States and as the states joined the Union with the population flow, they don't put the buildings right close to the road. They're actually buildings. Their house, right, their farmhouse is located off the road into the distance of a field, and then the field is bordered. So you would have it like this. So this would be the first fence, right? And this would be the second. Now you'll notice these aren't quite perfect for the size of the field. So these are obviously dating from a time when it wasn't considered about making them the same length. But it's an example of the length. You can see here pretty close to the proper length, and here pretty close to the proper width. So it's almost the same, right? So when you put the fences down, it's a nice configuration. They fit nicely. You can actually, if you want to, put them right on the cardstock. Let's get that going. So you see how the field, you could put the fence right on the field and then put the joining fences on the edge, and that's how that works. So as you can see, you can move the whole field around, okay? And then we'll put this one right here. So you see there it is. So the whole field can be moved around. Again, putting it right on the field like this. There's two lengths that are the same length as the card, and then two shorter lengths that are the same width as the card. See, so that you got them stuck on there, right? They're just sitting on there. You could, by the way, use sticky tack to hold them down. Instead of gluing them down, yeah, you could use sticky tack. The only thing is with sticky tack and fabrics is when you try to pull that sticky tack off, it can leave a residue because it's, you know, basically a putty, and it might leave a residue. But that's okay because you're probably going to put the fence on there anyway, or never even take the fence off. But you don't want to use glue. If you don't want to use glue because of its liquidy nature, or if it's hot glue, again, a different situation, right? But again, here's where you would use these small lengths of fence applied to the actual fabric before, or not, I should say that the fabric is not glued to a cardstock to be stiff. You want to leave the fabric as a fabric, so that you can go up the slope of a hill, right, with these little pieces. So you glue these in or sticky tack them down to the fabric, and then as you hold it in your hand, you'll see that it flops over because it's a fabric. And because the fences are not attached, as you form the fabric to the slope of a hill, these little fences will open and close as appropriately as the fabric flies up and down the side. For instance, when you have this configuration where they're really close, you won't be able to get that fabric. So what you want to do in the case of putting these on a fabric is kind of leave about 1/8 of an inch gap, so that when you go up the hill, maybe it's 1/4 inch, that field or that fence will follow the fabric. I mean, it'll bend properly without, you know, having an issue of contacting another fence. So there you go. Make as many of those as you think possible, because generally you'll need a whole bunch of those, like we have here on the table, just a slew of them. And then when you put them down, if they are on cardstock, which they kind of have to be on cardstock to work correctly, you can see that as we put these on, see how that's starting to form. Let's see, this is more correct. That's kind of more correct. And you can overlap card, see, to make a proper angle there. Hence the reason in so many battles they called them the bloody angle, because they were an angle of fences that came together. As a matter of fact, you know what? That may not be necessary to do it just like that. Let's change this. Do it like this. And also, this field could be right up against the road. So there we go. We kind of have it like that. And we can butt these up against each other like that. And there we go. So now we're making our whole field. So there we go. And that's how that starts. And then you just continue filling out the fields, putting down the trees. We got some bridges in. And then you can move on from there. Well, one thing you can do, and what is kind of desired to do, is remove as much predictability as possible. When you look at the game table in its first layout, for instance, in this example, we have no hills and no trees. If we were to have no hills and no trees, this is basically North Dakota, or I don't know, some place in Europe that it's very flat and no trees at all. So huge, you know, fields, Flodden or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, you got to remove the predictability in the system. And I'm not Ian Malcolm, and I'm not talking about chaos theory, but it is a complex system, and there is a certain degree of predictability every time you put up a war game table. For instance, let's start with how the units, how the opposing forces enter the field. Forget about why they're there. What direction are they coming in from? And is there one of the opposing forces already in place? And how much of that is in place? But when you look at the terrain, in this case, no hills, no trees, no obstructions, if you will. Sure, it's not a perfectly flat golf course, but it's relatively flat. Say it's, like I said, North Dakota, except no cornfields. Well, the truth of the matter is we haven't put cornfields out yet either, and we have several of those we can put out. But the predictability, when you look at the game table and you understand how the forces are coming in, can you predict how this is going to go? And the answer is usually yes, you can. By the terrain, at least. You can predict how something is going to happen because of what's available to be known. For instance, in this case, we understand, and actually in most cases, or if not all, war games with miniatures, it's as a attempt to be a fun but not too complicated simulation. Almost always, invariably, the main action area is going to be the middle of the table or the middle of the battlefield, right? The center of the battlefield. That's the thing to remember all the time. It's the center. It's the main focus. Any commander's main focus is his center. In the Civil War, generally, is where you put all your artillery. Well, I'm not so sure that that's something I would prescribe to. I actually would like to experiment more with putting artillery not in the center and keeping it on the flanks to resist any kind of an assault on the flanks. However, the flanks may be vulnerable as opposed to the center is not that vulnerable. So your artillery could be overrun if you're not careful in how it's placed and protected. Anyway, predictability. So even by looking at this game table with no hills and no forests, the predictability is centered, as I said, on the center, the middle of the game table, in this case, the battlefield. And what happens around the edges? Well, predictably, if the edges are to remain the way they look right now, nothing. Why? Well, because there's no protection there. So you could say that the activity areas happen only because there's protection there. Now, it kind of makes sense. You don't want to walk into an open field and face an enemy in an open field. Okay? Look at the movie The Patriot. At their battlefield scene, I don't remember what it was supposed to look like or what it was supposed to be portraying. But the American forces started relatively cohesively facing the British in an open field, head on, and no cover. And eventually, well, because of their immaturity, they fled. When they fled the field, the battle was over. And you can see in that particular case, it was a relatively open field. As a matter of fact, it was an open field. I think they were walking through cornfields, maybe, or harvested fields, but at any rate, flat. And of course, after that, commanders learned that the only way to defeat somebody in the open was to not let them have any advantage. So if you're going to walk up to them and shoot at them and keep shooting over a period of minutes, you'd better have a really good officer corps to keep the men in line, because as you can imagine, you're being shot and your friends are being hit and wounded around you. So eventually cohesiveness falls apart and you decide you've had enough, and that's it. You're not going to listen to anybody and you're getting out of there. Well, there you go. And ironically, as I was alluding to, that the center became, I think that's where the cavalry actually came in and attacked the center. So that's what drove it to a rout. Anyway, so we're looking at a situation where we're going to have commanders entering the field, and they will have to adjust their plan to any changes in the terrain. When the players sit down to play, the judge is going to say, okay, you know what, as a matter of fact, that's not actually there, that's over there. Or this thing is different, or you know what, instead of a field, it's actually a hill. That kind of stuff, modifying the game modifying the situation will cause the commanders to modify their activation sequence. So as units begin to enter, they're going to have to say, well, you know, you were going to do this when you entered, when you got here, but now you're going to do this instead. So of course, as I said, the situation isn't automatic. It actually, we leave it to a little bit of chance, actually a lot of chance, but percentage-wise, a commander fails if he rolls less than 30%. So on a D10, you roll 7 or better, or I'm sorry, under 7, and you're good to go. The new orders are issued, and the activation sequence can be adjusted for that unit. But then the next group that comes in, he has to do the same thing. So anyway, that's what we're talking about, and as we proceed, we'll decide what era we're actually going to be in here. I'm not entirely sure what the next thing is we're going to do, and then at some point, should we feel like it, we'll get back to that Hex Command Nova game and finish that game off with infantry activity and a ground attack and ground situation. So there we are, and we'll come back.